Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about environments. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, do you think there are any valid reasons for an enterprise application with many users to not have a development or test environment and only have a production environment? Yes, I would say so. So the obvious case to me is if you have a high integration system where you can't really connect to the other external systems and be assured that depending on your situation now that you can actually interact with those with test data or in if they have like various environments that you don't really have a good way of ensuring that they are working at all times, because some systems unfortunately have a situation where the approximation of a test environment or a development environment is so poor that your confidence in the stuff that you're shipping can only truly be validated once you're in production. Let me break this down a little bit for you. So the idea behind a development environment and a test environment and so forth, I argue, is to have an ability to simulate production. The reason why you want to do that is so that you can make sure that your code is working in a production quote unquote like environment. But if you can't achieve that, then it's a pointless environment basically. I argue at the very least, or rather, I'm not saying it's pointless, it's just that we're so ingrained into this that it's ridiculous. Where the especially if you have like a QA team and so forth, like there is no for them there is no universe where you would do it in any other way. At least the average ones that I've talked to, and I've always I've had this situation with a system that I worked on quite some time ago where I basically had this exact situation. We had was basically a UI application on top of like 13, 20 different APIs that all were at different levels of quality. And so, of course, every single time we tested something in the testing environment, everything worked, and then it went to production and then it broke because we couldn't make sure that the test environment was consistent with production. And so, what I suggest to people is honestly, what you should be working towards, if you ask me at the very least, because there are people who have done like there are other like if we sort of step away from web for a moment, there are development companies and platforms that have this down really well. And my favorite example is the mobile application developers. Mobile development is not like web, rather the workflow is not as it is for a web developer. If you take a look at things like feature flagging, that is basically a hard requirement for mobile development, due to the fact that if you change something in your app, it's not like web where you can just undo it and then when somebody goes to your website the next time it's going to work. If you broke something, that's not how mobile works. You ship once and then you have no way of knowing when the user is going to update or when all your users are going to be on the next version. So you have to account for that. Anything you send into production has to be reversible at all times. So you have to be able to control that in some way. That's why they use feature flag. And web is exactly the same thing, if you ask me. If you have in my little story here or in my example here, when I had a high integration system, that is what I told my developers. I said that we have tested our features to the extent possible in our development environments, but we can't trust, like most of the time, the other APIs are broken in their development environments. Because as you can imagine, if you have 20 integrations, there's always one of them that is down, practically. Like, I mean, if you have more than that, it's the same deal. Like, you cannot have a consistent setup in those sort of circumstances. And so what I told my developers was that or like my team, because I was the tech lead at that time, I said that what we are going to master is feature flagging, because it is the only way for us to be sure that our code is working. And that is why you have these other environments. If there's nothing in your process, if your process can't simulate a production like environment, then Well, there is a benefit, I suppose, to a certain degree, because of course not every single feature that you have is going to be like super coupled, because as I said, with integrations, it's sort of like if you're not working on that specific integration, then sure, you might just use a production or a development environment and so forth. But I even tell my software developers, like, your local workstation will work for, you know, UI component testing or stuff like that you don't need to have an environment full time for that, because what the workflow basically looked like for us in that situation was literally we tested everything locally and set it to the testing environment, and then just walk through the motions of doing exactly the same thing and then moving on to the next environment. And as I said, those environments were not a good representation of production, so it was really only truly in production where we knew if the code was working or not. And so what we did was the thing, like, I mean, you can do this in web as well, and I argue to people, you should be doing this. You should be using feature flagging and so forth, because basically what that does is that, like, my trick, this is just my personal one, is I have a for UI applications in this situation, it was very, very simple. This was a React application, and all I did or like what I did for the team, was to create a single React component and that looked at local storage. And if you set a variable in local storage, it would render the children of that component. If it was not in local storage, it would render nothing, which basically meant that if you wanted to do an A/B test, which just do a test for the testers, like, they could test in production every single time, because all we had to do was to wrap that thing around the UI components that we were shipping or so forth, ship it, and then they enabled something in production in local storage, and then they saw the version of the component that they needed to see. And then we had one that was like switching between like an old version and a new version. It was super, super simple. And then when they said, yeah, we're happy with this, you just removed it. Like, you remove the wrapper component that, like, you did the feature flagging. You can do the same thing with backend APIs and so forth and so forth. But in situations like this, I absolutely believe that there is it's not necessarily the case you don't need a development environment or a test environment and so forth, but I argue that there are absolutely situations where you should be able to test in production. And my argument is, regardless of if you have my situation or not, you should work towards that goal. Because as I said, even if you have those test environments, you are not guaranteed that your code is going to be working once it's in production. And I always argue for that. It is much better to have a really, really, really efficient rollback or roll forward, like, call it whatever, undo buttons. I like to call them undo buttons. Like, if you can undo whatever you did in like that, then you'd remove the whole problem of release fear and all these other things that becomes very sensitive for a lot of people when they don't have a lot of trust in the system. And my argument, no testing process will ever be so perfect that you never have any issues in production. And the cost of testing more and more and more and more and more is just going to increase. So it's actually a lot more efficient for you if you figure out a strategy of making a mistake basically like completely pointless, like, or rather there's no cost to you that you made a mistake or there was an issue in production. And that's why the mobile developers, I argue, they basically have to be good at this, because without that, well, as you can imagine, if you ship something that is broken and then you fix it the day after, and then you have no idea like how many months or maybe years or whatever the application is going to stay out there, well, you probably have to account for being able to at least turn off the feature for the people who are still on an old version of your app. So what I want you to take away from this is that, yes, I absolutely believe that there is a valid reason for just having a production environment. My case here was one such situation. I've had other cases where I worked for a company where the application we built was embedded into one of their mobile platforms, which forced our developers to test in production every single time, because that was the only environment, again, where we could get real information, where we could be confident in that the testing that was being done was accurate with how it would work for the user. And that's the thing that I think that we need to get away from this testing environment and development environment. I'm not saying we shouldn't use them. I'm saying that the mindset is so wrong. It's become a doctrine where you have a test environment and you have a development environment. But I always ask the developers, and the same thing with the QAs, what is the purpose of these environments? When you understand that the purpose is to have a production-like environment so you can try things out before the user sees it, then you understand that everything that is in terms of value related to these sort of environments is based on the assumption that you can create something that is so close to production that you feel very confident that it's going to work in production. If you can't reach that confidence, or if you don't need a dedicated environment, you just need to do like if local testing isn't good enough or like so forth, you have to think about why do you need it. And on the whole, I still argue, regardless of if you use a test environment or a development environment or so forth, using things like feature flagging, and well, I'm not saying you have to go all the way to canary releasing and stuff like that, or having an idea of how to validate things in production is a very good strategy, because ideally, if you ask me at the very least, you should never need a test and development environment. You should have such a foolproof plan for testing so that you never have a production issue. And if you do have a production issue, it still doesn't matter, because you have robust strategies and ways of dealing with it. That is the ideal case, because I promise you this much: if the QAs could test in production and your managers and so forth, like everybody could basically test everything in production, they would. And so if you can figure out how to do that without all the issues that are associated with that traditionally, that's the best thing for you, because everything else is an approximation to being able to validate things in production. That's the thing you need if you take something away from this. Remember that. The best situation is to test in production for you, but to be able to do that safely without any issues or risks or so forth to the system or the users, that's the tricky part, and that's why you usually have these other environments. But remember, if they can't deliver a very close approximation, and you can't trust that you have you know that it's going to work in production, then why do you have the environment? Have a great day.